I don't know about you, but I find agonizing over the fine detail of something I need to buy really, really difficult. One such scenario, two immense trail eMTBs, the Neuron from Canyon and the Neuron Fly, pretty much identical in terms of shape and purpose and also suspension travel, and both ludicrously fun to ride. In today's video, we are going to be comparing the two bikes to build a picture of two different breeds of trail eMTB. Two bikes. Now, it's worth thinking about your intended use of a bike such as this. Are you the kind of rider that goes for a 2-hour blitz in turbo, or maybe an all-day ride in eco? Right, these two bikes, there's only a few kilos difference in the weight. They both have Bosch motors. This bike has slightly more power and also has got more fuel in the tank, hence that difference in weight. Other than that, and other than maybe obviously the componentry difference between two bikes, they're actually pretty close. Some people might consider this a heavyweight versus lightweight e-mountain bike comparison. I don't think that's accurate, and neither is the fact that lots of people, lots of bike brands even, compare this bike to a mountain bike. Again, I don't think you should be doing that because, let's face it, both these bikes are just so much better up, down, along and across. You get more miles from an eMTB, blah, blah, blah. So let's just think of them as two trail eMTBs. I think this is actually a proper mountain bike ride. That hill that we went up earlier, I would simply be pushing or slogging up it on a analog mountain bike. Hey look, now don't get me wrong, there are differences in how these bikes feel. For example, this bike feels a little bit more lively than this bike, which in turn you can definitely feel that power going uphill. In terms of power, now some people might say what we have here is a full power bike versus a mid-assist bike. What have we actually learned about power? The first thing is that power is actually on a sliding scale from say around 50 Newton meters from the lowest power e-bikes up to over 100 Newton meters for the highest power e-bikes. Within that, many brands are wanting to categorize bikes based on low, mid and full power. The problem with that is what actually is full, mid and low power. For example, this bike is definitely faster uphill than this bike, but in turn this Bosch SX will be slower up a hill than some bikes with over 100 Newton meters of torque. That is a fact. So what is power? I think it's actually pointless trying to categorize e-bikes based on power, and I'm going to stick to that for now. I mentioned earlier that this bike feels a little bit more lively than the Neuron. What I mean by that is that the wheels on the Neuron probably don't leave the ground as readily as they do on this bike, and I mean that 2 kilos, it does make a difference for sure. The thing is, the time you've got a range extender on, that difference is going to be less, so it comes down to just how you ride this bike. The most important thing to understand is about the type of bikes these are, the shape and purpose of the Neuron. The trail bike is a fantastic choice of eMTB. It's pretty much the do-it-all bike, trail centres, adventure riding off the waymarked way, going up, going down and along. It strikes a great balance. These beauties then are varieties within that breed, each suited to different environments and, very importantly, different people, you guys. I'd actually call them Neuron CX and Neuron SX.
Now, talking about breeds, see down there, Welsh Mountain sheep. A couple of varieties, notably the Black Welsh Mountain and the South Wales Welsh Mountain, which is a little bit bigger. Key thing about those sheep, you can leave them on the hill all year long, and they're really sure-footed out on pieces of scree. Talking of which, this bike, this is a proper mountain eMTB. You might have seen this in our recent trip to northern Italy, where we took this bike up to 10,000 feet. Plenty of range, plenty of travel, and of course, that CX motor, a little bit more power for the punchy climbs. Of course, the Neuron Fly is a recent addition to the flock, absolutely on fire in trail centre situations, loves single track and loves sheep tracks. A bit like that one, although that little beauty loves a bit of off the beaten track action, a bit like a goat. So you could say Neuron on goat, Neuron on sheep. So the sheep, well, that sheep is so noisy. Right, so this bike then has a lower level of assist than the Neuron with the Bosch CX motor on the other bike, an SX motor in this one. Is that a good or a bad thing? Well, if you think of it like this, you've got Coke Light, you've got mayonnaise light, they're all there to make you healthier. Is this bike a healthier bike? Well, let's talk about effort then. Now, the effort on the whole, now this very much depends on you, the rider, and where you ride, will be slightly more on this bike. And the reason for that is that the medium level of assistance, the kind of Tour Plus mode on this, will be less than it is on the Neuron. The second thing is that, yes, there's less likelihood for you to be lazy on this bike. And the third thing is that the level, the ceiling of assistance is lower on this bike than it is on the Neuron. But when it comes to the type of riding, that's what we want to tune into next.
Yes, it's a mountain bike for these kind of adventures which we're on today. But I tell you what, wow, a 2-hour smash out loop in turbo is just as fun.
Now, don't for 1 minute underestimate the capability of these fly bikes. Now, this is obviously at the more extreme end of the spectrum, but ultimately, effort and what's possible is down to you guys. Now, I'm guessing you guys have got to this part of the video and you're expecting some answers. Which bike is best? And fair enough. Well, I actually think that on flat single track, that bike, the Neuron Fly, might have the advantage, especially above 25 kilometers per hour. Because let's face it, most people will not be using that bike in places such as this. However, should you want a little bit more oomph for those technical climbs, then it could be that this bike has the edge. So let's break it down into up, down and along. Let's discuss each scenario for each bike then. Now, when you're going uphill, we need to consider motor power and character, yes, for sure. But rider weight, angle of slope, degree of technicality and rider skill are equally important. Because in actual fact, you could ride certain uphills just as fast on the SX bike if you spin the cranks at 120 RPM. Secondly, a lighter rider will not always need that CX turbo power, whilst a heavy rider on a steep hill definitely will. And rider skill will be as important as power in steep technical terrain. Now, the great thing about the CX bike, if you are inclined to do this kind of riding, is that you've got a little bit more time on the crank and a bit more overrun. And also, the possibility to do stuff like that if you want. Just some facts for you guys on a medium to steep grade fire road climb. Difference between the fly bike and the Neuron, you're looking at about 5 seconds per minute for a 95 kilo rider. And the other thing is, who actually rides against the clock anyway? What about both bikes in a downhill situation? Again, degree of technicality, angle of slope, rider skill are all key. But think about this, if your ride is actually weighted more towards downhill capability, then maybe you should be looking at the Spectral or Strive-On bikes instead. The bottom line is both the Neuron and the Neuron Fly are pretty head-to-head in a downhill situation.
Neuron Fly, Neuron. Just want to log this thought. I think rather than compare this Neuron Fly to a mountain bike, just talk about how
so much more technologically advanced this bike is than a mountain bike. And yeah, I've had a good day, a really good day. Now here's one to think about, and that's the component specification. We saw that out in the mountains that the Neuron on super tech uphill terrain might have the edge, but to be able to do that kind of climbing, you do need high volume, super aggressive, super tacky tires. If you're going to ride the Neuron in its more natural environment, which is single track, trail centers and sheep tracks, then a low profile, fast rolling tire will actually have the edge, especially when you're going above 25 kph, which is why I think the Neuron Fly might have the edge in this kind of scenario. In terms of the component specification comparison between the two bikes, 400 watt hour internal battery on this bike, which you can't remove, versus a 750 on the Neuron. Do remember that you can have a 250 watt hour range extender on this bike, which will have an impact on the weight. Now, when you're talking about the weight of the two bikes, 19.1 kilos for this bike, 22.5 for the Neuron. If you bolt on a 1.5 kilo range extender, obviously the weight difference is going to be less. Bosch SX drive on this, 65 Newton meters versus the Bosch CX performance line on the Neuron, which is 85 Newton meters. Electronic gears on this bike versus manual on the other bike, but otherwise you're looking at the controller, the remote, you've got the app. Remember, a whole new world of possibilities in terms of navigation, of route finding and post-ride analysis. So, you know, these both bikes are already a whole new world above a mountain bike. Now, I've had a day on this bike out in the mountains, and it's really got me tuned into the ways of this bike. My senses are now tuned in to the Neuron Fly. What I want to say is, do not underestimate the value of familiarizing yourself with an eMTB, because let's face it, we do have the full power bikes and we do have mountain bikes. This bike sits in the middle, and I think you need to ride it for more than 2 hours to get used to it. But more than that, I want to emphasize the fact that I think mountain bike brands do need to talk a little bit more about just how much more technologically advanced this bike is than a mountain bike. Two things you guys are going to need answers for is range and effort. In terms of range, 400 watt hours on this bike versus 750 watt hours in the Neuron. Yes, the Neuron's are going to be able to ride for longer. However, things can get equaled up with that 250 watt hour range extender. I can do a 2 hour ride in turbo on both bikes with that range extender fitted on this one. In terms of efforts, comparing the two bikes in a good old fashioned cross-country trail center environment, funnily enough, my heart rate is actually higher on the CX bike, and I think the reason for that is that things just happen so much quicker. The corners come at you quicker, the hills come at you quicker, and so my average heart rate is probably about 5 beats per minute higher. However, the bottom line in all this is actually it's your mindset which dictates how much effort you put into both bikes. So both bikes are pretty equal. One caveat to that is if you've got a really long, hard, technical mountain climb, you'll be amazed how high your heart rate will go on that CX bike. Let's conclude then by returning to what I mentioned earlier, that both bikes are incredibly similar, certainly in terms of geometry. There is half a degree difference on the head tube angle, 64.5 on this bike versus 65 on the Neuron. Therefore, the wheelbase is slightly longer on this bike, which is going to add to the overall stability. Otherwise, the reach is the same, which has an impact on the sizing, and also the chain stays the same. I've been having to think about this. Why would you choose one over the other? Right, this is what I think. I think if you can live without the temptation of that turbo mode on the CX motor, and if you don't ride super technical climbing terrain, and maybe if you're a lighter rider, then I'd possibly weigh yourself more towards this bike. However, if you do ride the super tech climbs and you do need that turbo mode to make the ride, you've got the option of making the ride easier, then maybe the Neuron is the bike for you. What's the bike which I want to spend more time on? This one. I think there's so much more to learn about the ways of a bike such as this. So folks, please subscribe to the channel, give us a thumbs up if you like this video, and any questions about the two bikes, please get involved and I can answer them for you. Thanks for joining us.